Hey guys, this is Caleb with DSLR Video Shooter, and today we're going to take a look at how I took some scrap wood, made a box, added a couple accessories, and turned it into what I'm calling the Cine box. So the Cine box, for lack of a better word or name, is simply a wooden box that has a battery on it and a couple ways to mount other accessories. The whole reason I built this thing was I've always loved the idea of the C100 cameras like the Sony FS700, where you have a slightly larger camera than something like a mirrorless camera or a DSLR, but you have everything you need right there. Power, audio, the whole 9 yards, top handle, all that good stuff. So I wanted to replicate that in a way that I could throw any camera at a rig and it would kind of simulate that style of a cinema camera. So something like this would be great for shooting short films, documentaries. It would be awesome for interviews because all the power, monitoring, and audio is packed into one device with the camera. But I also wanted to be able to quickly remove the camera if I needed to. So that's what inspired this project. So as a quick overview, here it is here. You can add any camera to the front. You can move the camera forward and back. And then on the back, you'll notice there is a wooden box here. It is mounted in the same way that the camera is mounted. We'll look at all that here in a second. It can be moved forward, back, left, right. It's very versatile. On the one side of it, we have a preamp. This is the Saramonic Smart Rig Plus, which I just finished a video on, and it's attached with magnets, so it just pops on. On the other side, if I spin it around here, we have a bunch of cold shoe mounts, so you can add 2 audio receivers like you see here, and really anything with a hot shoe mount. On the very back, we have a battery plate. And I'm using Sony MPF batteries because they're very versatile and they're used to power a ton of different gear. And that is fed to 2 jacks here, which can be used to power something like a monitor, the camera itself. So you can power 2 devices off of the one battery, which is pretty slick. So other than that, we have a top handle, which is really nice because it can be flipped around, moved forward and back. And that's pretty much a quick overview. Now, before we dive into how I built this, make sure you check the description and the blog post that I'll have down there for all of the parts and where you can find everything. I use Amazon for almost everything, so you can probably save some money if you went to eBay or found some things locally, or maybe you already have some of the stuff that we're going to be using to build this. So now let's head over to the bench and see how I put this thing together. The first thing I did was cut up a bunch of small pieces of wood. Essentially, we're just going to be building a box here, and we'll be mounting different gear to the box itself. So it's really, really simple, nothing crazy difficult. The only thing to keep in mind is that I inset the back of the box by 2 inches, and that will accommodate a battery. I also cut the corners off of that rear end so I could easily access the battery. But you can really do anything you want here. The only thing you need to really pay attention to is the height of the box to ensure that the top handle will go over the camera, and then trying to keep the box as thin as possible so you can put things on the sides without it being too bulky. In the end, here are the dimensions for the box that I built. Next, I just used wood glue to attach all the pieces together. Wood glue is actually stronger than screws and nails, and if you use it correctly, the wood is going to break before the actual glue joint. So just make sure you have plenty of glue on each of the joints, and remember that if you have squeeze out, you know you're doing it right. Normally, I would use brad nails to attach the box together while it glued, but I understand that most of us don't have a compressor or a nail gun lying around, so I'm going to be using screws here. This makes it possible to immediately assemble the entire box, but if you have a little bit of patience, I would recommend clamping each of the pieces individually to let them dry. This way you don't have to use a ton of screws, and it'll still be really, really strong. As you'll see later, screws can be kind of a pain with thin material like this, and it's going to create tear out on this plywood and a couple other issues, which will all be cleaned up in the end. Another thing to note, you can use any material. I would recommend using MDF because it's a lot easier to paint evenly, but I wanted to get this project underway, so I just used a couple of scrap pieces of plywood. Also, make sure you drill holes for each of the screws. and countersink. This way we can cover up the screw heads later. So here's the completed box. Again, it looks terrible, but we'll clean that up a little bit later. The next thing to do is add mounting points for all the different gear and a couple holes for some electronics, which are very simple to install. I found a 5-pack of these cold shoe mounts on Amazon, and these are really, really nice. They come with 1/4-20 bolts, but I just decided to use small screws to attach it to the box. In the end, that was plenty strong, but if you wanted to make it even stronger, you could use epoxy or super glue. I wanted to use 2 RoadLink receivers on the side of the box. The problem with these is because of the way the cable comes out of the unit, they're kind of tight to fit 2 there. So I ended up using 3 cold shoe mounts on the one side of the box. That way, if I just wanted to use 1 receiver, it could fit right in the middle nicely. But if I wanted to use 2, I had that option as well. Next, we need to work on the top handle. The top handle slides on a rail that's going to be placed on the top of the box. To mount this, I started by just doing 2 holes and then using drywall screws to mount the rail to the box. Later, we'll be taking these screws out and we'll actually epoxy the top rail in and use the screws, and that'll be more than strong enough. Next, we need to mount the quick release plate to the bottom of the box, and this will let us mount it to the final setup, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Once again, we're going to later epoxy this to the box and use screws, but just for now, I'm going to use screws to get it in place. On the other side of the box, I'm going to be mounting a Ceramonic Smart Rig Plus. This is a killer preamp that I've talked about in another video. Originally, I was also going to use a cold shoe mount and attach it that way, but in the end, I decided to take a different route because using the cold shoe offset the preamp by enough where it was really far out there hanging off of the box. It made the box feel huge and was kind of obnoxious, so I decided to use magnets, which we'll take a look at here in a second. Next, I'm going to be drilling 2 holes for the female DC power jacks. Somehow I massively screwed up the placement of the second hole, so I had to drill a 3rd one. And if you make any mistakes, don't worry about it because we're going to be filling in all these holes and all this mess in a little bit. The DC jacks I'm using aren't actually jacks, they're just female connections on the end of a cable. So they're going to be really easy to wire up. We don't really need to solder them, and we'll be using wire nuts, which will make life a lot easier. And both of these jacks will supply power from the battery. With those holes drilled, I went ahead and drilled a hole on the back of the unit where the battery is going to go. And this is how the wires are going to attach to the battery plate. I simply drilled a hole where the contacts on the back of that battery plate land, and then we're pretty much done with drilling holes. Next, I removed all the stuff we just added and then removed the side plates so that we can work on the electronics. I used some hot glue to attach the jacks into the holes, and then I cut the wires roughly in half, stripped the ends, and twisted them. Next, we need to prepare the battery plate. This is the only part of the project where I did any soldering, so if you're new to that, don't worry, it's pretty straightforward. First thing I did was use a screwdriver and scuff up each of the contacts. On this particular battery plate, there were 3 contacts. One is going to be positive and the other 2 are going to be negative. In the end, this is what it should look like. Next, I ran the wires from the battery plate through that hole that we drilled and use super glue to attach the plate to the box. I've done this a couple times, as some of you will know, and super glue has worked just fine. If you're still concerned and you want something a little stronger, epoxy would also do the trick. Now for the easiest part of the wiring, all we have to do is connect the positive wire from the battery plate to both positive wires on the 2 jacks. I just use a small wire nut for this. Then all you have to do is the same thing for the negative. So the negative or black wire from the battery plate to the negative black wires on both of the jacks. So in the end, you'll have something like this. I then went ahead and tested the jacks using a monitor, and this monitor is from iCan. We'll be using it a little bit later, and it's great because it can take 5 volts all the way up to, I think, 15 volts. So it's a very versatile power consumption monitor and great for a rig like this. And those 2 jacks are going to be able to power anything that uses that Sony MPF style battery, which is most monitors, lights, and a ton of other gear, as well as cameras. So it's a great choice for a project like this. Now that we know that everything's working, we can glue and screw that whole panel to the box. Now that we have the box glued together completely, it's time to fill in all these nasty holes. Wood glue is a great option for this. You can use normal wood glue. I wanted to experiment with this epoxy resin wood glue, but in the end, the goal is the same: to fill in all the holes, cover up the screw heads, and give us a nice smooth box. Once all the wood glue is in, you can then sand the box smooth. Next, it's time to work on the preamp. I did lots of testing with magnets next to the unit, and there aren't going to be any issues. And these magnets are pretty weak. It's not like we're sticking a massive magnet next to the unit. To make sure it was flush, I cut off those little tabs on the back of the unit. Next, I used super glue glue and super glued the magnets down on the back of the unit. It doesn't matter which side or polarity you are gluing down, as we'll deal with that later. Once the glue is dried on those magnets, I added a second magnet to each one of the ones we just glued down. With that done, I put a drop of super glue on each of those magnets and then glued the entire thing down to the box. Once that's done, we can easily remove the preamp from the box, and that'll let us use it elsewhere or change the battery out, and we don't have to fiddle with any screws or cold shoes. And on top of all that, this thing is nice and flush against the box. You could use fewer magnets, but having a bunch like this will ensure that it always locks in place and it won't twist at all. We're almost ready to paint this thing, so the next step is to remove the top rail as well as the bottom quick release plate and epoxy it back on with screws. Any of the two-part epoxies out there will work well, and this stuff is crazy powerful, so make sure you don't get it on your skin, and know that it'll be quite strong once it's dry, especially with those screws in place. Now here you can start to see why I think MDF would make a good option for materials, just because this plywood still showed a bunch of grain after spray painting. If I'd used a brush, it probably would have hidden it a little better, but at any rate, it's painted. Now we can work on the base system for this entire setup, and it's really simple. Essentially, the way this works is there's one giant quick release plate that we're going to mount everything to. Now, I've been using Arca Swiss plates for a long time now, and I really dig them, but you can probably use any quick release system you want as long as they have a long plate option. So back to the plates. We have a long plate at the bottom with several different mounting holes, and what I did was take one quick release clamp and put it at the front, and that's going to be for our camera. I then added a second quick release clamp to the rear, but I rotated it 90 degrees. This will let us move the rear of the rig left to right. I then took a quick release plate and another quick release clamp and attached them together. This will let us move the box forward and back. This second rear quick release clamp is optional, but it was nice to be able to move this thing forward, back, left, right, and have that flexibility. It also raised the box up a little bit so that I could use it with taller cameras like this Canon DSLR. Now we can finally put everything together, adding the camera to the front, the second quick release on the back, and then the actual box to the back. From there, we can add the battery to the back of the unit, the preamp to the side, and then we can add the handle and mount it either forward or backward depending on weight distribution and the size of the lens we're going to be using. So that is how it went together. Has worked really well. I really dig it. There's a couple kind of frequently asked questions I've already been asked, and I want to get to those now. The first one is, how are you going to deal with blocking the screen on the back of the camera and accessing the buttons? So first and foremost, you're going to need a monitor unless your camera has a flip out screen, something like the GH4, the Canon 80D, something like that. So if you have a flip out screen, no problem. You can still use that because it'll be off to the side. But if you're using a Canon DSLR with a fixed back or any of the Sony cameras, you're going to need a monitor. The monitor I've been using is the iCan VL35. I've done a review that you can check out for that. I really dig it. It's nice and small. It can handle 4K signals. It's awesome. Otherwise, you can add really any other monitor to make this work. And the other part of that question is buttons. How are you going to access the buttons if you've got this thing up against the back of the box? And that depends on your camera. A lot of cameras have buttons on either side. So if I'm holding the camera, I can access most of the buttons that way. If you're finding it's a little difficult to access the buttons, all you have to do is move the camera forward, and that's going to allow you to easily see and access the buttons. The other nice thing with having the camera movable forward and back is that I can actually use the camera grip, and there will be room for my hand there. So pretty versatile, and I don't think that's going to be a big issue for most shooters. The next question is the weight and strength of this whole thing. Because if you think about it, this handle and the box is what holds everything. I've been using this for a little while, and I am not worried about strength at all. Because we used wood glue and screws and epoxy for everything that's attached together, this thing is wildly strong. When you move it around, there is zero flex anywhere, and because the handle isn't super cheap, it's pretty nice. So I wouldn't worry about that at all, unless you're going to try to mount a FS700 on front of this thing, which is just stupid because there's no reason to do that. And finally, the big one, how much did this thing cost? I went ahead and tallied up everything, and the costs came down to $240 and change. So pretty affordable considering what you're getting here. Now that doesn't include the monitor or audio devices, but it does include the preamp and all the rigging parts, including all the bass stuff here. So the only thing you'll need to add potentially is a monitor and whatever devices you want to mount. So pretty affordable, I think, for what you're getting out of it. So that does it for this video. If you liked it, please give me a thumbs up. Subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. Make sure you check the description for links to all the parts and some other information. And I will see you guys in the next video.